Hi everyone, this is Mike coming to you from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. We play rated games every Wednesday night, and this is one of them, which I'll get to in a second, but I wanted to introduce the idea of this new YouTube channel, which had several contributing factors. One is a hat tip, basically, to two of our better players, Roger and Brett. When they have played games recently, they've followed up by recording videos describing what they were thinking and what they thought of various positions as they play through the moves. And they'll throw in some engine calculation to see what was the truth, per se, of the position. But I got to thinking that I, for one, think that I've probably fallen into a trap of relying on engines too much. It was not long ago that you'd play an opponent, maybe go over the game afterward. You'd, read a Grandmaster collection of games and books and follow the analysis. And we've certainly gained a lot from engines, but I think maybe there's a trap there. So I got to thinking that it would be kind of nice to get back to where we were analyzing for ourselves, and came up with the idea of a channel which maybe would be named "What Were You Thinking?" And the pun there in this episode, if there's another, we'll see, is about missing the point about blunders. So I've queued up a game here, which I played the black pieces with against Paul, maybe a little over a month ago. And it was a fairly slow-moving game to begin with. You can see it was more or less a mirror image for a while until it started to get a little bit of imbalance. Paul had his knight on b3 for a while, and I advanced my a-pawn, and eventually Paul went to d4, and now he's back on c2, and it turns out that was a pretty good post. Now, in a couple moves, you'll see a blunder that I made, but my assertion is that isn't really where I lost the game. I think it's more in line with that I didn't prepare the position well enough to continue to advance on the queen side. So I set this position up from Paul's viewpoint to emphasize that there's an obvious move available to Paul, which is bishop to b4, attacking my knight, so developing with tempo. I haven't played my knight anywhere, say, to h5. It's not really the time to do that, but that's a way to keep Paul's bishop away from b4. But really the right way, which I had planned, was to play e5. And I thought, I have two strong center pawns. He has a majority on the queen side, but it's a little, the c5 pawn would fall eventually. And then maybe we'd start playing chess. Right now it's just getting to the point where the game is beginning. Now, to the point about engine analysis, I'll just note that the engine is basically split between e5 and rook e8, with the idea of supporting e5. So I don't want to get bogged down in that, because I want to just make the point that the key here is to control the e5 square so that bishop can't get out. And in the game, I played to get to that point, and then somehow I lost the thread and started focusing on how I was going to take that c5 pawn, advance my b pawn, develop this bishop to one of two squares on the queen side, maybe on the king side, and off we go. Obviously, Paul's getting moves in between there, and that all affects what I would do. But like I said, I started to focus on recovering the pawn that Paul is up. And so it's either queen takes or knight takes. And the point of missing the point about the blunders is that this whole thought sequence entirely misses the point of the game. Like I said, it's about controlling e5, at least right now. So I went ahead and took that pawn with my knight. And I thought it was a bit of a toss-up, but we'll move on from there. And then, of course, Paul played bishop to f4, and I sat there thinking, how is it that I didn't play the move that I had planned to play, wanted to play, intended to play, but didn't play? And so that's where the idea of the engine can't really tell us why that happened. So the idea of analyzing for ourselves comes in. So next is where the game falls apart in terms of the blunder. But at this point, if the queen goes back to d8, then the engine has it as dead even. And so basically, we've just kind of, positioned a little bit. Maybe if his bishop wants to stay there, I could try to kick it. More than likely, he'll go to e5, which he did a while later, and try to trade off my fianchettoed bishop. But I didn't go to d8. I went to a5. And this was entirely a miscalculation. And so it rightly deserves the classification as a blunder. What I missed, and curiously, when we discussed the game a little afterward, Paul had missed, and he was a little surprised by this because this move, because he said, well, if he plays b4 and I take en passant, then we're just going to have another trade, and we'll trade along the file on a1. And maybe he can gain the file, but there's a lot of liquidation involved. But the problem with all of that is this pesky knight on c2 protects the rook. And so we don't have to trade down the heavy pieces, which means that my queen is in big trouble. And it turns out that, of course, b4 forks my two pieces, and I lose a knight. So, okay, I lost a knight, and it didn't feel that great. Second thing that Paul said about the game right after the game was that, aside from losing the knight, he thought that I played well. It was like, okay, well, thanks. And it turns out the engine agrees. If, like, Lichess engine has a grouping of how bad the errors are, from inaccuracies to mistakes to blunders. We both had 3 inaccuracies, and of course I had the blunder, and that was the difference in executing the game. So yes, otherwise it was a clean game, but like I say, when the time came to play the correct move, I missed it. And so that's why I say the blunder didn't really matter as much as playing correctly before the blunder. So as another example, here's another game that I've just queued up that I played online on chess.com a little while ago. It started off as an Evans Gambit, but my opponent declined it, which is why you see the queen side looking a little bit unusual in the sense that the b pawn is still there, etc. In this game, I was white, and it was an interesting game in the sense that I felt like I had an initiative, I had pretty good scope for my bishops, but there were some problems. And in order to keep my lead in development that I felt I had to castle, play my bishop to b2, and my rook to a1 to get the file, and do that before he could get the file. The engine noted in this game that I made 2 blunders, both with my queen, and here's the second. The first one is probably not that interesting because it was just a opening move choice. You could choose anywhere. But my opponent at this point played e4. Now, you'll note that I was castled, and I don't look castled anymore, but I'd calculated that in order to use the center of the board and my bishops, I had to let my opponent have what amounted to a bit of a sham attack, loose attack on the king side. But there are a lot of tactics here, like windmills and queen invasions and such, so I realized that I had to just walk my king away from there and play elsewhere. The blunder here, according to the engine, was that it expects that knight takes the e4 pawn, and then probably f takes knight and queen takes pawn, giving up the piece for 2 pawns, but opening everything up is the way to go. I didn't really see it that way, and the reason I chose to show this game is it's in keeping with something Paul often says. So since I focused on our game in the first game, I thought I would mention Paul's theory or guideline that you shouldn't look for mate in 5 if you can just play the moves that you find more natural over the board. Imagine it in crunch time with the clocks ticking, because you have to continue to execute the rest of the game. And so I didn't see that knight takes e4 was the best way to go for how I had already intended and planned to play. I had a plan that said I was going to try to dislodge the bishop or queen and start to get the scope of my king bishop to be better. And you can see that his pieces aren't all that well coordinated, and so I ignored that play, that sacrifice, and I played queen to c4. And according to Stockfish, this is a blunder. But like I said, it's in keeping with the ideas that I had been thinking about and working toward. So I didn't think that undoing that plan made sense. And I guess that's the main point. Just to rip through the rest of the moves, in order to open the scope, I had to sacrifice my b pawn, which only opens up the b5 square for my knight, hitting the queen, letting the pawn run, etc. And he kept at it with the kingside attack. But even though these pieces start to look kind of scary in the face of no defenders around my king, it wasn't really, in the sense that I had the initiative. So I was able to, I'll just play the moves fast. I promoted to a knight so that I would get the check so that I could get my bishop in play, and then felt that my queen and my bishop and this other knight might win the game. And at this point, my opponent resigned. So the idea here for the second game was, sure, there was a blunder from the viewpoint of the engine, but it doesn't matter because I wasn't going to play that, not that move, but that plan. So it was outside the scope of what I needed to do, plan to do. And so therefore, I think I safely discount the idea that I blundered. It didn't matter. So I think that's probably enough for this episode. Thanks for watching, and if you care to leave a comment, go ahead. Thanks.